Have you ever stood in a room full of hundreds of people and felt completely invisible? Not invisible like you're shy or quiet. Invisible like you've been erased. Like the very person who created the man being celebrated just became background noise. That's where I was standing on what was supposed to be one of the best days of my life. The sun was beating down on that fancy vineyard outside Napa, making sweat roll down my neck even though I was dressed in someone else's jacket. The roses around me cost more than I make in a month. The champagne probably cost more than my truck. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had any idea who I was. I'm Franklin Reed. I raised my son Caleb alone after losing my wife when he was just 15 years old. I gave that boy everything I had. I worked with my hands until they bled. I saved every penny. I sacrificed birthdays and Christmas mornings because I wanted him to have a better life than I did. And on this day, watching him marry Isabel Monroe, I thought all of it had been worth it. Then the wedding coordinator walked up to me and handed me a black jacket. "Staff should wear these while assisting," she said, not even looking at me in the eye. I laughed. I thought it was a mistake. I told her, "Ma'am, I'm not staff. I'm the father of the groom." But even as I said it, something in my stomach twisted. Something felt wrong. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. That's when I heard her voice, Isabel's voice, cutting through the garden like a knife. "Perfect. Thank you. That's him." Those 4 words. That's all it took. The coordinator nodded, smiled, and walked away. The message was clear. In Isabel's world, I wasn't the father of anyone important. I was the help. Guests were already arriving in expensive cars. Men in tailored tuxedos that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Women in gowns that shimmered under the California sun. They looked at me, really looked at me, and something shifted in their eyes. I saw the moment they decided I belonged on the other side of their circle. One woman actually waved her empty champagne glass at me. "Darling, could you refresh this?" she asked, as if I'd been born to hold trays and smile politely. I could have corrected her. I could have told her I was Franklin Reed, that I'd paid for this entire event with my retirement fund. But I didn't. I just took the glass and walked away. That was my first mistake. That was the moment I decided silence was safer than truth. Throughout the ceremony, I stood at the back. Not in the crowd. Not with the family. At the back, wearing a borrowed jacket that didn't fit right, watching my son marry a woman who'd convinced him that I didn't belong in his new life. Caleb never looked for me during the vows. He never glanced over to see where his dad was standing. He just kept his eyes on Isabel and smiled like she was the only person in the world. I told myself it was fine. I told myself this was what happened when your kids grew up. They build their own lives and you become background music. You become the man who used to matter but doesn't anymore. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened next. When the reception started and the MC called for the father of the groom to stand, Isabel didn't hesitate. She leaned over, smiled sweetly at the crowd, and said something that would change everything. Something that would make me realize exactly what my sacrifice had meant to these people. Something that would prove my son had become someone I didn't even recognize. And that's when I understood. I wasn't just being ignored. I was being erased. My wife's name was Margaret. That's where this story really begins, not in that vineyard, but years before, when I was a young man with a wife who believed in me and dreams that seemed impossible. We met in high school. She was this bright, warm girl who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. When Margaret looked at me, she didn't see just a working man with rough hands. She saw potential. She saw a future. We got married young, too young maybe, but we were happy. We had Caleb when we were 23, and suddenly, Everything I did had a purpose beyond myself. Then she died. Suddenly. A stroke at 42 while she was making dinner on a Tuesday night. One moment she was humming in the kitchen. The next moment, my entire world collapsed. Caleb was 15. He'd just started high school. He had his whole life ahead of him, and now we were both learning how to survive a kind of pain that doesn't make sense. You don't wake up one day planning to bury your wife. You don't imagine yourself explaining to your teenage son why his mom isn't coming home. For the first few months after Margaret died, I barely functioned. I'd go to work as a carpenter because I had to. I'd come home and look at Caleb sitting at the dinner table, and I'd see him trying so hard to be brave, trying so hard not to cry in front of me. So I'd be brave too. I'd make him dinner, nothing fancy, usually just simple things like pasta or chicken. We'd eat in silence most nights, both of us missing Margaret's voice filling the quiet. But slowly, something changed in me. The pain didn't go away. Pain like that never goes away, but it transformed into something else. It became fuel. It became a reason to wake up every morning and work harder than I'd ever worked before. Every nail I drove, every board I cut, every project I took on was for Caleb. Not just to put food on the table, though that too, but to give him something Margaret had always talked about: choices. Margaret used to say that the biggest gift you could give your child was options. A man without options is trapped by his circumstances, she'd say. But a man with choices, he can build the life he actually wants. After she died, that became my mission. I worked 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks. I picked up extra jobs on weekends. I didn't buy new clothes or go out with friends anymore. Every penny I made went into a savings account that I told Caleb was his future. I invested in real estate with my wife's sister. My wife and I had bought a small piece of land years before, and I held onto that like it was sacred. Because it was. That land was the last thing she'd touched before she died. Caleb was smart. Real smart. Not the kind of smart that comes from books, though he was good at that too, but the kind of smart that comes from watching your parents struggle and deciding you don't want to struggle the same way. He studied hard in high school. He made good grades. He got into a solid university and decided to study finance. When he told me his major, I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of pride. "I want to help people like you, Dad," he said. "I want to teach people how to make the most of their money so they don't have to work their whole lives just to survive." I hugged him that day and didn't let go for a long time. That was my boy. That was the result of all those years of sacrifice. He wasn't just going to survive like I had. He was going to thrive. He was going to help others thrive. That's where Isabel came in. Caleb called me one Sunday and told me he'd met someone at university. Her name was Isabel Monroe. She was beautiful, he said. Smart too. He wanted me to meet her. I remember feeling nervous about it, the way fathers do when their sons start dating. You wonder if this girl is going to be good enough. You wonder if she'll understand your son the way you do. Then I actually met her. She showed up at our house on a spring afternoon wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had blonde hair, perfect teeth, and this kind of practiced smile that made you feel like she'd done this before. Met people from different backgrounds, I mean. She called me "sir" the entire first visit, which somehow made me feel both respected and uncomfortable at the same time. She brought a gift, some fancy wine that I knew immediately I'd never drink because it was probably worth saving. She complimented my woodworking, though I could tell the sawdust smell bothered her. She laughed at Caleb's jokes like he was the funniest person alive. She was charming. She was polished. She was everything I wasn't. Looking back now, I think I wanted to believe it would work out between them. I think I wanted my son to have the kind of life where his girlfriend came from money and wore expensive clothes and didn't have to worry about bills. I thought maybe that would make up for losing his mother. Maybe if Caleb could have this one thing, this girl, this different world, it would somehow balance out the pain. I was so focused on making sure he had options that I missed the most important one, the option to choose a woman who actually respected him. And his father. 2 years later, Caleb called me on a Tuesday night. His voice sounded different, heavier, like he was carrying something he didn't want to say out loud. "Dad, I have something to tell you," he said. My first thought was that something was wrong. That's what you think when your kid's voice changes like that. Something is wrong. But then he said it. "I'm getting married." Isabel said yes. I didn't know whether to be happy or terrified. Both, I guess. I was genuinely happy for him. Caleb had worked so hard, studied so hard, and he deserved to have something good in his life. But I also knew Isabel's family. I knew what they represented. And I knew that marrying into that world meant my son was moving further away from me into a life I didn't really understand. "That's wonderful, son," I told him. "I'm happy for you." But even as I said it, I could feel something shifting. Caleb and I had always been close. We'd been through hell together after Margaret died. But lately, he'd been different. Softer with Isabel. More distant with me. He'd started using words like portfolio and investment strategy without explaining what they meant to me. He'd stopped calling as much. When we'd get together, he'd be checking his phone, eyes half on some conversation about money or stocks or things that bored me to death. I told myself it was normal. Your kids grow up and they build their own lives. You don't get to be the center of their world anymore. Someone else takes that spot. That's how it's supposed to work. At least, that's what I told myself back then. Then the Monroe family got involved. The Monroes had money. Not just comfortable money. The kind of money that owns things. The kind of money that makes decisions for other people. Isabel's father, Mr. Monroe, was a real estate developer. Her mother, Catherine, came from old money, the kind that actually had family names carved into the sides of buildings. When Mr. Monroe heard that Caleb and Isabel were getting married, he immediately started talking about making it grand. He wanted a luxury vineyard outside Napa, he said. 300 guests minimum. Imported flowers. A designer wedding planner. The kind of wedding that gets featured in magazines, not the kind that regular people have. I offered to help, of course. That's what fathers do. I'd spent my whole life saving money, thinking about Caleb's future, and here was an opportunity to contribute something meaningful to a day that actually mattered to him. I had some savings set aside, not a fortune, but enough to make a real difference. I wanted to give that to my son. But every time I brought it up, Isabel would smile that practiced smile and say something like, "Oh, Mr. Reed, we wouldn't dream of it. You've already done enough." There was something in the way she said it, like my enough was already measured and complete. Like I'd already given what I was expected to give and now it was time for me to step back. I didn't push it. I told myself they had the resources to handle it. I told myself it was fine to let other people take the lead. I was wrong. A month later, Caleb called. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Dad, the venue is more expensive than we thought. Isabel's parents say they can't cover everything. Could you maybe help with a loan? Just to fill in the gaps? We'll pay you back, I promise." I didn't hesitate. Not for a second. My son had never asked me for much. And this wasn't about money for him to spend on himself. This was about making his wedding day perfect. This was about making sure that the woman he loved felt celebrated. How could I say no to that? "Of course, Caleb," I told him. "Tell me how much you need." That number started small. $50,000. Then it grew. 60,000. 75. 100. Before I even understood what was happening, I was writing checks that were eating through decades of savings. I wasn't just taking money from my emergency fund. I was taking the money Margaret and I had saved together for our retirement. I was signing away part of that sacred land, the last physical thing I had left of her. I wired $650,000 to the wedding vendors and planners. I wired it under my name. I made sure everything was documented properly because I believed in doing things the right way. I wanted this to be a loan that I could eventually forgive, but a loan nonetheless. Something between a father and his son. I thought I was securing my son's happiness. I didn't know I was signing away my own dignity. I remember the moment I signed the papers to sell part of that land. My hands were shaking, not from anger or fear, but from something else. Something like grief. That land meant everything to me. Margaret and I had bought it together when we were young and stupid and believed that life would turn out the way we planned. We'd walked that property together 1,000 times, talking about what we might build there someday. She'd planted a tree there, right near the edge, and every time I'd visited that land after she died, I'd walk straight to that tree and just sit with her for a while. Now I was selling it. Not all of it, just a piece. But still, I was letting go of something that felt like the last real connection to her. And I did it without hesitation because my son needed help. Because I thought that's what love meant. You give until there's nothing left. The realtor tried to talk me out of it. "Mr. Reed, are you sure about this?" she asked. "This is a significant property. These kinds of decisions deserve careful thought." But I'd already made my decision. I'd already decided that my son's wedding was worth more than my security. I'd already decided that being the kind of father who says yes was more important than being the kind of father who protects himself. "I'm sure," I told her. And I signed the papers. I wired the money to the vendors. $650,000. It left my accounts like water pouring out of a bucket with a hole in the bottom. I watched the balance decrease and told myself it was worth it. I watched my retirement fund shrink and told myself I'd figure something out. I watched that piece of Margaret's land transfer to someone else's name and told myself I was doing the right thing. For about 2 weeks, I felt proud of myself. I felt like I was finally proving to my son that I loved him more than I loved myself. That I would sacrifice anything for his happiness. That despite the distance that had grown between us, despite the way he'd started treating me like I was from a different planet, I was still all in. I was still his father. I was so focused on that feeling of pride that I missed all the warning signs. I didn't notice that Caleb stopped calling me to ask about the money. I didn't notice that Isabel never once thanked me. I didn't notice that the wedding invitations went out and I got one that felt different from everyone else's, like it was given to me out of obligation rather than desire. I told myself these things didn't matter. I told myself that love isn't about gratitude or recognition. Love is about sacrifice. Love is about showing up, even when no one's watching. Especially when no one's watching. But I was wrong about that too. A week before the wedding, Caleb came by my house. He looked different than I remembered him looking. More polished. More like them. He was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, carrying himself in a way that said he'd been practicing how to fit into a world where I didn't belong. He gave me the details about the wedding day. When to arrive. What to wear. He kept it clinical, like he was giving instructions to someone he'd just met, not his father. And I noticed something in his tone, something that sounded almost like embarrassment. "Dad, there's going to be a lot of fancy people there," he said. "Isabel's parents' friends. Business associates. Really important people." I nodded. I wasn't sure why he was telling me this like it was a warning. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable," he continued. But what he really meant was, "I want to make sure you don't embarrass me." And I understood that message loud and clear. "I'll be fine, son," I told him. "I'm just happy to be there." But even as I said it, I felt something cold settle in my chest. I felt the weight of what I'd done. I'd given him everything, and somehow, it still wasn't enough. Somehow, I still wasn't enough. That night, I sat in my workshop and looked at my hands. They were still rough from years of work. Still stained with sawdust and old paint. These hands had built things. These hands had held my son when he was a baby. These hands had signed away my future for his wedding day. And I wondered, did he even see them anymore? The rehearsal dinner was 2 nights before the wedding, at some fancy restaurant in downtown Napa that probably didn't even have prices on the menu. I wore my best suit, an old navy piece that Margaret had picked out for me years ago, back when she was alive, and I still felt like I belonged in her world. When I walked in, the Monroe family was already there, holding court like they owned the place. Isabel's mother, Catherine, was wearing something that looked like it was made of crystals and air. Her father, Mr. Monroe, stood with his hand on Caleb's shoulder like he was claiming ownership of my son. They saw me come in, and something shifted in their faces. Not quite a frown, but not a smile either. It was that look you get from people who've decided you belong in a different category than they do. Mr. Monroe actually patted my shoulder when he saw me. "Ah, the working man himself," he said with this laugh that was supposed to sound friendly, but sounded like a jab. "You must be proud of your son, marrying into our little circle." I laughed it off. I always laugh things off. That's what I'd learned to do. Make myself smaller, make myself less threatening, make myself disappear into the background so nobody has to feel uncomfortable about the difference between us. "I am proud," I told him. Very proud. But there was something in the way he said, "our little circle," that told me I would never be part of it. That my son might be welcome, but only if he left me behind. Caleb spent most of the evening mingling. He moved through the crowd like he'd been born into it, laughing at jokes I wouldn't understand, talking about things I'd never heard of. I sat at a table mostly alone, pushing food around on a plate, trying to look like I was comfortable when I felt anything but. Isabel floated past me at one point, looking like something out of a magazine. She leaned down and said quietly, "Oh, Mr. Reed, please, at the ceremony, just keep things simple, okay? It's a very elegant crowd. You don't need to give a speech or anything." I understood what she was really saying. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't remind everyone where my son came from. Don't make us uncomfortable. "Of course," I told her, and I smiled like it didn't hurt. That's the moment I should have understood. That's the moment I should have seen what was coming. But I was still too caught up in trying to keep the peace, still too focused on making everyone else comfortable, still too invested in the lie that my sacrifice would somehow make my son love me more. As the evening went on, I watched Caleb talking to his boss. The man was laughing, touching Caleb on the back, looking at him like he was proud. And I realized, my son had found a new father figure. Someone from his new world. Someone who understood that world in a way that I never could. I didn't feel angry about it then. I just felt tired. I left the rehearsal dinner early, telling Caleb that I needed to get some rest before the big day. He barely looked at me when I said goodbye. He just nodded and turned back to whatever conversation he was having with whatever important person was standing next to him. The drive home, I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she'd always believed that family was everything. That no matter how much money you had or how successful you became, your family was the only thing that really mattered. She'd believed that right up until the moment she died, probably without knowing that the family she'd worked so hard to build would eventually fall apart. I thought about my son, and I wondered when exactly he'd stopped being my son and started being a stranger wearing my son's face. But the worst part, the part that kept me up all night? I was still planning to show up the next day. I was still planning to smile and pretend like everything was fine. I was still planning to let myself be erased because I thought that's what love meant. I didn't know yet that the next day would teach me something I should have learned a long time ago. The vineyard was even more beautiful on the wedding day than I'd imagined it would be. The morning sun hit those imported roses and made them glow like they were on fire. The tables were set with white linens and gold chargers. The string lights hung between the vine trellises like someone had captured the stars and strung them up for decoration. Everything was perfect. Everything was absolutely perfect. And I was completely invisible in the middle of it. When I arrived that morning, I'd dressed carefully. I'd ironed that old navy suit until it looked as good as it could. I'd polished my shoes. I'd even tried to do something with my hair, though it was never going to look like the kind of hair these people had. I was nervous, but I told myself that was normal. Any father would be nervous on his son's wedding day. I pulled up to the vineyard at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the ceremony was supposed to start. I thought I'd have some time to talk to Caleb before things got crazy. I thought maybe we could have a moment together, father and son, before the day pulled him away from me forever. The wedding coordinator met me as I was walking toward the main tent. She was a woman in her 50s, dressed all in black, carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Franklin Reed, the father of the groom. I wanted to come early and see if there's anything I could help with." She looked at me the way you'd look at a lost puppy who'd wandered into your house. Like she wasn't quite sure what to do with me. "Of course," she said. "Actually, perfect timing. We could use some help with the setup. Let me get you a staff jacket so you can assist." I opened my mouth to correct her again, but she'd already turned and was walking away before I could say anything. A few minutes later, she came back with a black jacket that didn't fit right and a task list that included moving chairs and setting up the bar. "You can start with these," she said, pointing at a stack of white chairs. "We need them arranged in rows facing the arbor." I could have walked away. I could have called Caleb and told him what was happening. I could have stood my ground and made it clear that I was his father, not his staff. But I didn't. I just put on the jacket and started moving chairs. That's where Isabel found me. I was arranging the 5th row when I heard her voice calling from across the garden. "Perfect. Thank you. That's him." She was talking to someone on her phone, probably the photographer or the planner. She was saying something about how everything was coming together beautifully, how the day was going to be absolutely flawless. She waved at me. Actually waved. Like I was someone she'd hired through an app on her phone. Like I was temporary and replaceable and of absolutely no consequence to anything that mattered. "Mr. Reed," she called out in that sweet voice, "could you make sure the glasses are polished? We want everything to sparkle today." I looked down at the black jacket I was wearing. I looked at my hands holding the chair. And something inside me went quiet. Not angry. Not yet. Just quiet. Like a door closing somewhere in my chest. "Of course," I said. And I finished moving the chairs. Throughout the morning, more guests arrived. They came in luxury cars and wore clothes that probably cost more than I made in a year. The women had their hair done up in complicated styles. The men wore designer suits and expensive watches. I was still wearing that black jacket, moving things from place to place, being completely ignored or actively ordered around by people who had absolutely no idea who I was. One man actually snapped his fingers at me. Snapped his fingers. And asked me to get him a coffee. I got him the coffee without saying a word. I just nodded and walked away. Around noon, I caught sight of Caleb. He was in the groom's suite with a photographer taking pictures in his tuxedo. He looked good. Really good. He looked like a man who belonged in this world. He looked like someone I didn't recognize. I tried to catch his eye through the window, but he didn't see me. Or maybe he did and just didn't acknowledge it. Either way, the message was the same. I was invisible. By the time the ceremony started, I'd given up pretending I was part of this day. I stood at the back of the vineyard in my borrowed jacket, watching my son marry a woman who'd convinced him that I didn't matter. Watching him smile at her like she was the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. Watching him completely avoid looking in my direction. The photographer took a picture of the happy couple. Then another. Then another. Every angle, every moment. But when it came time for family photos, I wasn't called over. Isabel's parents stood with the bride and groom. Isabel's siblings stood with them. Caleb's boss, the man I'd seen at the rehearsal dinner, even stood with them for a photo. But not me. Never me. I stood alone at the edge of the property, still wearing the black jacket, watching my son become a stranger, and that's when I realized something that would change everything. That's when I understood that I hadn't just been disrespected. I'd been deliberately erased from this moment. And worse, my son had let it happen without saying a single word to defend me. Something shifted in me then. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Something sharper. It was clarity. And it was about to explode. The reception was chaos masquerading as elegance. Servers passed around appetizers on silver trays. The wine flowed like water. Guests mingled and laughed and took pictures of everything. It was the kind of party that rich people throw when they want to prove to other rich people that they can afford to throw an expensive party. And I was still wearing the black jacket. Somewhere around cocktail hour, I was standing near the bar when a woman grabbed my arm. She was drunk, not falling over drunk, but that polished kind of drunk that rich people get when they've had 3 glasses of expensive wine. "You there," she said, snapping her fingers at me just like that other guy had done. "Could you refresh this? And get me some of those little shrimp things while you're at it?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. And I realized that she genuinely believed I was staff. That there was no way her brain could compute that a man wearing a black jacket at a fancy wedding would be anything other than someone she'd paid to be there. I didn't get her the shrimp. I didn't refresh her drink. I just walked away. I found a quiet corner near the garden where no one was looking, and I stood there for a while just thinking. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have said if she could see this. I thought about how I'd given everything I had, and my reward for that sacrifice was to be treated like I was nothing. The father-son dance was supposed to happen around 7. I knew that because I'd read the wedding itinerary that Caleb had emailed me weeks ago. I stood near the dance floor, waiting to see what would happen when the MC called for me. The DJ's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the father-daughter dance." Isabel's father took her hand and led her to the dance floor. They swayed together while soft music played, and the guests took pictures and made sounds of appreciation. It was everything a father-daughter dance is supposed to be. Then the MC made the next announcement. "And now, we'd like to invite the father of the groom to join us for a special dance with our groom." I stepped forward. This was it. This was the moment where everything would change. This was the moment where I would finally be acknowledged. This was the moment where... Actually, Isabel's voice cut through the crowd. She was laughing, that practiced laugh that made it seem like she was sharing a joke. "Caleb's mentor is here, his boss, and he's been such an important figure in his life. Would you like to dance with him instead, sweetheart?" The crowd laughed. They actually laughed. Like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Like the idea of the father of the groom dancing with his boss instead of his actual father was absolutely hilarious. Caleb hesitated. For just a moment, I saw something in his face. Confusion, maybe. Or shame. Or regret. But it was so quick that I might have imagined it. Almost immediately, he smiled and nodded. "That sounds great," he said. His boss stood up. He was a man in his 40s, dressed in an expensive suit, looking like he'd been waiting for his moment in the spotlight. He took Caleb's hand and they moved to the dance floor while everyone watched. And I just stood there. I stood there in my borrowed black jacket and watched another man dance with my son. I stood there and felt something inside me break. Not in a sad way, but in a way that felt like finally seeing clearly. Like scales falling off my eyes. The camera flashes went off. People cheered. Caleb smiled like he was having the time of his life. And I understood, in that moment, that my son wasn't embarrassed by me. He wasn't uncomfortable. He was relieved. He was relieved that I was out of the picture, that I wasn't making things awkward, that I was finally allowing myself to disappear. If you've ever felt completely invisible by the people you love most, if you've ever been pushed aside and pretended it was okay because you thought that's what love meant, then you understand what I was feeling in that moment. You understand the moment when you stop trying to make yourself smaller, and you start understanding that the people who are asking you to disappear are the ones with the problem, not you. I walked away from the dance floor. I walked across the vineyard, through the gardens, away from the cameras and the laughter and the music. I found the head server, the one who'd been directing people like me all day, and I asked him where the microphone was. The one they used for toasts. In the tent, he said, pointing. By the bar. I walked over there, and I told the MC exactly what I was going to do. I need to say something, I told him. Before dinner is over. I need the microphone. He looked at me like I was crazy. Are you part of the family? He asked. I'm the father of the groom, I said. And I think it's time everyone knew who paid for this wedding. His eyes went wide. He looked around nervously, clearly unsure if this was some kind of security issue or a family drama about to explode. But he nodded and said, "Okay. I'll give you the mic after dinner. But if this gets weird, I'm going to need you to keep it brief." I told him I would. I spent the next hour sitting alone at a table, watching my son and his new wife cut the cake, watching them kiss for the cameras, watching them dance with everyone but me. I watched him laugh with his boss. I watched him put his hand on the small of Isabel's back like she was the most precious thing in the world. I watched him be the man she'd turned him into. And I waited. When the toast started, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The best man went up and told stories about my son that I didn't know. The maid of honor made everyone cry with something sentimental. Isabel's parents toasted to their daughter's happiness. But no one mentioned where the money had come from. No one mentioned the $650,000 that had made this entire day possible. Then the MC caught my eye. He nodded. It was time. I stood up. I took off the black jacket. I actually took it off and dropped it on the chair, and I walked toward the microphone. The crowd was still chattering, but when I took the mic, the sound of my voice caused everything to go quiet. Like someone had hit the mute button on the entire event. I looked out at the faces in front of me. I looked at Caleb sitting at the head table. I looked at Isabel smiling her practiced smile. I looked at Mr. Monroe, who was starting to look worried. And then I began to speak. "Good evening, everyone," I said calmly. "I know most of you have no idea who I am. All day, you've been asking me to bring you drinks and move your chairs and serve you food. And I let you believe that because I wanted to understand what kind of world my son was marrying into." The murmuring started. People were confused. Caleb's face had gone pale. "I just want to thank you all for being here to celebrate my son's wedding," I continued. "It really is beautiful. And I'm deeply touched to see my $650,000 investment put to such good use. From the imported roses to the vintage wine to every single thing you see here, I paid for it. All of it. You could have heard a pin drop in that entire vineyard." The music stopped. The servers froze. Every single person turned to stare at me like I'd just announced something insane. But I wasn't done. I'd like to remind the bride and groom that as per the contract under my name, the payment for all these vendors is due at the end of tonight. Every penny. So I trust you'll be ready to settle the bill, or have your lawyers ready to discuss the property titles I'll be reclaiming. Isabel's face went from that perfect shade of bridal white to something that looked like death. Her father choked on his drink. Actually choked. Someone had to pat him on the back. Caleb just stared at me, and I saw something break in his expression, like he finally understood what he'd done. Like he finally realized that his father wasn't invisible after all. The whispers started like fire through dry grass. Phones came out. People were recording. I could see it happening in real time, this moment spreading through the crowd, becoming the story that would define this wedding. And just for clarity, I said, looking directly at Caleb, I'm not staff. I'm not the hired help. I'm Franklin Reed. I'm your father. And I'm the man who made sure this fairy tale had a stage. I handed the microphone back to the stunned MC and walked toward the exit. Guests parted like I was Moses and they were the Red Sea. No one said anything. No one tried to stop me. I walked out of that vineyard, and I didn't look back. Behind me, I heard Isabel start to cry. I heard Mr. Monroe shouting into his phone. I heard the buzz of 100 conversations all starting at once. But I didn't turn around. I got in my truck and I drove home, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt something like peace. The phone started ringing while I was still on the highway. First it was Caleb. I didn't answer. Then it was a number I didn't recognize, probably their lawyer. I didn't answer that either. I just drove home and sat in my workshop, surrounded by the half-finished projects I'd been working on before my son's wedding had consumed my life. I pulled out a bottle of whiskey that I'd been saving for something special, and I poured myself a glass. It tasted like closure. It tasted like finally telling the truth. The next morning, the calls started coming in for real. Vendors were panicking. They wanted to know where their payments were. They wanted to know if the groom's family could cover everything. They wanted to know who Franklin Reed was and why his name was on all the contracts. I had documentation for everything. Every receipt. Every wire transfer. Every contract with my signature on it. I sent it all to my lawyer and told him to freeze all payments pending legal review. I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it because I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. I was not a backup plan. I was not someone's last resort. I was a man who had sacrificed everything, and I had a right to protect myself. 3 days after the wedding, Caleb showed up at my doorstep. He looked like he hadn't slept. His hair was messy. His clothes were wrinkled. He'd lost that polished look that Isabel's world had given him, and for a moment, I saw my son again. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on that single word. "Dad, what did you do?" I didn't invite him inside. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, this man who'd become a stranger, and I felt both sad and angry and completely at peace all at the same time. "I told the truth," I said simply. "You embarrassed us," he said. "You embarrassed me." Those words hit like a punch, but I didn't flinch. I'd been preparing for this moment my entire life, the moment when my son would choose someone else over me, when he would decide that I was more of a liability than an asset. "No, son," I said quietly. "I didn't embarrass you. I revealed you." He stared at me, and I saw tears start to form in his eyes. "We can't pay the vendors. We're going to lose everything. Isabel's parents are furious. The lawyers are threatening lawsuits. Dad, you've destroyed my marriage before it even started." Part of me wanted to back down. Part of me wanted to be the father who fixes everything, who makes the pain go away, who sacrifices his own well-being for his child's comfort. That part of me was strong and it was loud. But I'd already listened to that part of me for $650,000. I wasn't going to listen to it anymore. Caleb, I gave you everything I had. I gave you choices. I gave you opportunities. And the moment I wasn't useful to you anymore, the moment I became an inconvenience, you erased me. You treated me like I was less than human. That's not true, he said, but his voice was hollow. He knew it was true. Your mother believed that family was everything, I continued. She believed that blood mattered more than money, more than status, more than anything else in the world. And I raised you with that same belief. But somewhere along the way, you decided that what Isabel and her family wanted was more important than who I was. You decided that I was an embarrassment to hide rather than a father to be proud of. Caleb didn't say anything. He just stood there, and I realized that he didn't have a response to that because deep down, he knew I was right. The contracts are in my name, I said. The vendors are waiting for payment. I'm going to wait 72 hours for you and Isabel to figure out how you're going to handle this. After that, I'm handing everything over to my lawyers. Dad, please, he started to say, but I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't do anything dramatic. I just closed it quietly and went back inside. I sat in my workshop and I looked at my hands again. Those rough, working hands that had built so much and sacrificed so much and apparently meant nothing to the person they'd sacrificed it all for. The 72 hours passed. No call from Caleb. No communication from Isabel or her parents except for messages from their lawyers asking if there was any way to negotiate. I didn't respond. I handed everything over to my legal team and then I let it go. What happened next was textbook. The vendors sued. The Monroe's attorneys tried to claim that the money was a gift, not a loan. I provided documentation proving it was a loan with specific terms. Courts got involved. It was messy and expensive and completely necessary. But here's the thing about truth, it has a way of coming out. The story leaked to the media somehow. Social media picked it up. Within a week, it was being covered by local news. A man sacrifices his entire retirement for his son's wedding and then gets treated like staff. It was the kind of story that people can't help but talk about. The narrative shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the bad guy who'd ruined his son's wedding. I was the father who'd been disrespected and humiliated. The public was on my side. Isabel's family's reputation took a hit. There were articles about entitlement and classism and the way wealthy families treat people they consider beneath them. Caleb's boss even fired him, saying that the scandal wasn't good for the company's image. Everything my son had been trying to move toward, the approval of Isabel's family, the respect of the wealthy elite, the feeling of finally belonging to something bigger than his roots, it all crumbled. And it crumbled because he'd been willing to sacrifice me to get it. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you love, hit that like button right now. This is the kind of story that needs to be heard. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the final chapters of this story, because what happens next will shock you. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever stood up for yourself the way Franklin did? Have you ever had to cut off someone you love to protect your dignity? Tell me your story, because your experience might inspire someone else who's going through something similar. 3 months later, I was working in my shop when I heard a knock on my door. It was Caleb. But this time, he looked different. He'd lost weight. He was dressed in regular clothes, nothing fancy. He looked like the boy I'd raised, not the man Isabel had turned him into. "Dad," he said, "can we talk?" I could have said no. I had every right to turn him away. But he was my son, and no matter what he'd done, that didn't change. We sat in my workshop, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of wood and years of my life's work. And he told me everything. Isabel had left him. The marriage that had started with such fanfare had fallen apart almost immediately once the money and status were no longer guaranteed. Apparently, she'd already started dating one of her father's business associates. Caleb had lost his job. His friends from Isabel's world had disappeared. He was living in a small apartment and working at a coffee shop, trying to figure out who he actually was underneath all the lies he'd been telling himself. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, and I could see that he meant it. "I'm sorry for treating you like you didn't matter. I'm sorry for letting her convince me that you were an embarrassment. I'm sorry for not standing up for you at my own wedding." I listened to him, and I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have wanted me to do in this moment. She would have wanted me to forgive. She would have wanted me to open my arms and welcome my son home. But I also knew something else. Forgiveness without boundaries is just teaching people they can hurt you without consequences. "I forgive you," I told him. "But Caleb, forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. Trust takes time to rebuild. And you need to understand something. I didn't do what I did to punish you. I did it to show you that there are consequences for the choices you make. That you can't just use people and throw them away when they're no longer useful." He nodded, and we talked for hours. We talked about Margaret. We talked about the choices he'd made and why he'd made them. We talked about what it meant to be a man of integrity, to stand by the people you love, even when it's not convenient, even when it's not profitable. Slowly, over the following months, my son came back to me. Not completely at first. We had to rebuild what he'd torn down. But I could see him changing. I could see him understanding, for the first time, what his mother had tried to teach him before she died. That family is the only real investment that matters. One evening, we were sitting in my workshop, and he asked me if I regretted anything. If I regretted giving him so much. If I regretted the wedding, or the money, or any of it. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. "I don't regret loving you," I said finally. "I don't regret wanting the best for you. But I do regret not loving myself enough to walk away sooner. I regret thinking that my value as a father was measured by how much I was willing to sacrifice. Because love isn't supposed to make you feel small. Love isn't supposed to make you disappear. Real love is a two-way street, and for a long time, I was the only one walking." Caleb listened to this, and I could see something shift in his face. He was growing up. Not into the man Isabel had tried to make him become, but into the man he was always supposed to be. The lawsuits eventually settled. The Monroes paid what was owed, though they did it grudgingly. I didn't take the money they offered beyond what had been agreed to. I didn't need their money. What I needed was for my son to understand that his father had value, that his father mattered, that his father would never again allow himself to be treated like nothing. I kept working as a carpenter. I rebuilt my savings slowly. I started spending more time at that piece of land where Margaret had planted her tree, and I watched my son become someone I could be proud of, not because of what he had or where he worked, but because of who he was when all the external markers of success were stripped away. Sometimes life teaches you lessons through pain and humiliation. Sometimes you have to be erased before you understand your own worth. Sometimes your children have to betray you before they can truly appreciate you. That's not the way it should be, but it's often the way it is. About 2 years after the wedding, Caleb and I were working on a project together. We were restoring an old cabin on the edge of that sacred piece of land, the land that Margaret had loved. It wasn't a big project. Just fixing the roof, repainting the walls, making it into something we could both enjoy. As we worked, I realized that I'd never really forgiven myself. I'd forgiven my son. I'd moved on. But there was still a part of me that felt shame about how easily I'd been used, how quickly I'd been discarded, how little I'd valued my own well-being. I sat down on the porch and just looked out at Margaret's tree. And I finally let myself feel what I'd been avoiding feeling for 2 years. I cried. Not angry tears. Not bitter tears. Just the kind of tears that come when you've finally allowed yourself to acknowledge pain that you've been carrying for too long. Caleb came and sat next to me, and he didn't try to fix it or make me feel better. He just sat there with me, and sometimes that's all a father needs from his son. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know," I told him. "And I forgive you. But I'm also forgiving myself. I'm forgiving myself for not seeing what was happening. I'm forgiving myself for not protecting myself. I'm forgiving myself for believing that love meant erasing myself." We finished that cabin over the next few months. When it was done, Caleb suggested that we could rent it out, make some money from it. But I said no. I said I wanted to keep it as a place where we could come together. A place where we could remember where we came from. This story isn't about revenge, even though it might look that way. It's not about humiliating people or proving that you're right. It's about something much simpler and much more important. It's about understanding that your value doesn't come from what you give. It comes from who you are. It's about learning to love yourself the way you love the people you care about. You can forgive people who hurt you, but you should never forget those who pretended you didn't exist. Because when you remember, you protect yourself. You teach other people that you matter. You show the people who love you what respect actually looks like. Margaret used to say that the most important relationship you have is the one with yourself. I didn't understand that when I was young. I thought it was selfish. But now I know it's true. If you don't respect yourself enough to stand up for yourself, no one else is going to do it for you. If you don't love yourself enough to protect yourself, you're teaching everyone around you that it's okay to treat you like you're nothing. My son learned that lesson the hard way. So did I. But the difference is that I learned it by living it, and he learned it by losing everything. I wouldn't recommend his path to anyone. As I sit here now, 5 years later, I think about how different my life could have been if I just said no. If I'd just drawn a line and told my son that I loved him but I also loved myself. If I'd been willing to sacrifice my relationship with him to protect my dignity. But I also know that I couldn't have done that. Because that's not the kind of man I am. And that's not the kind of father I wanted to be. I wanted to give everything. That's just who I am. The only thing I can control is whether I let people take advantage of that or whether I teach them that giving is a privilege, not a right. The story of my wedding day taught me something I'll carry for the rest of my life. It taught me that love without boundaries isn't love. It's just pain with a pretty name. It taught me that sometimes you have to let people experience the consequences of their choices. And it taught me that dignity is worth more than approval, that respect is worth more than money, and that being invisible to the people you love is worse than any humiliation anyone could ever inflict on you. If this story has moved you, if you've ever been in a position where you had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting someone else, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications so you don't miss a single story. Because there are so many stories like this out there. Stories about families torn apart by misunderstanding, by pride, by the choices we make when we're young and foolish. Stories about redemption and healing and learning to value ourselves. Share your own story in the comments. Tell me about a time when you had to stand up for yourself. Tell me about a time when you realized you mattered. Tell me about a time when you finally learned to love yourself the way you loved other people. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Because here's what I've learned through all of this. We're all just trying to figure out how to be human. We're all just trying to find our value in a world that tells us we should measure ourselves by what we have and what we do. And sometimes, we have to lose everything to realize that we were never the things we lost. We were always the ones doing the losing. The best day of my life wasn't the day Caleb was born. though that was pretty good. It wasn't the day I married Margaret, though I loved her with everything I had. The best day of my life was the day I stood up at that wedding and told the truth. The best day of my life was the day I finally decided that Franklin Reed mattered, that my dignity was worth fighting for, that being invisible was worse than being humiliated. And you know what? It was worth it. All of it. Every painful moment. Every regret. Every tear. Because I learned who I was when everything else was stripped away. I learned that I was stronger than I thought. I learned that my value wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion of me. I learned that love is a choice, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. That's the real story here. That's the thing I want you to take away. Not the revenge. Not the drama. Not the scandal. But the lesson. The simple, beautiful lesson that you matter. You matter so much. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be part of your life. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story. Tell me in the comments what you think Franklin should have done. Tell me if you would have handled things differently. Tell me about your own journey to self-love and self-respect. Because your story matters too. And someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for reminding me why stories like this matter so much.